I am so excited to introduce you to Professor Jane Risen. ExecOnline is a proud partner with Chicago Booth, and we're so excited to have Jane Risen with us here today. Professor Risen is a professor of behavioral science at the John E. Duke Faculty Fellow in the Chicago Booth. Jane L. Risen conducts research in areas of judgment decision-making, intuitive belief formation, magical thinking, stereotypical and stereotyping and prejudice, as well as managing emotion. And with that, I am so happy to hand things over to you.
Hi, Jimmy Beth. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody for joining today and having me here. So over the last many number of years, we've seen more and more organizations try to foster diversity, equity, and inclusion. But we've also seen organizations struggle to do so. So although awareness and interest has been quite high, it seems like know-how is falling a little bit short. And that's what I want to think about today. What I want to do is start by asking some big, broad questions, right? The what, the who, the why, the when, and the how of fostering diversity, equity, and inclusion. And when we ask these big questions, I think what we can zero in on are some of the common mistakes that organizations make within each one, and then think about how we can do better. So let's start with the first four. When it comes to the what are we paying attention to? What are we trying to do here? I would say that one of the most common mistakes, and many of you have probably seen this, is for organizations to focus exclusively on the diversity side, the D part of it, and to forget about inclusion. And so what that means is lots of organizations will focus on getting a diverse representation of employees in the door and think that that's going to then solve all of their problems. But it's not enough. And the research shows us that, and the experience that organizations have had trying to do it shows us that too. And so the tagline that I want you to keep in mind, you've probably heard before, is diversity doesn't stick without inclusion, right? And so inclusion, as Jimmy Beth kind of already highlighted for us, it's the degree to which different voices of a diverse workforce are respected and heard and contribute. And in an inclusive organizational culture, employees feel as though they are accepted and that they belong. And so you're going to need to consider goals that you have beyond representation if you want to think about improving diversity, equity, and inclusion. So don't get stuck on just the D. The second part that I want to think about briefly is the who. Who's responsible for doing this work? And I would say here that a very important and common mistake is for people to just think, well, that it's somebody else's problem, right? Now, who is that other person? Sometimes that's going to be, if you have a D&I office at your organization, you might think it's their job, or HR is typically sort of given this responsibility by many, or sometimes the employee resources groups are expected to make these contributions. And everybody has a role to play, and it's important to kind of, again, back to a tagline, inclusion starts with I. You want every member, every employee, every person who you're working with and interacting with in your organization to recognize that they are part of the effort towards creating an inclusive organization. And so when people feel that responsibility, it's going to be a lot easier to get whatever your D, E, and I goals in throughout the organization. The next part is the why. And here, what I think the most common mistake is not having the wrong why, but not having one at all. And so a lot of organizations don't know why they're doing this work. They're kind of jumping on a D&I bandwagon because others are doing it or it seems important, but they don't know why their organization needs to do it. And so if you want to make sure that this is really built into the fabric of your organization and not bolted on as an afterthought, I think it makes sense to try to align your D&I goals with the broader goals that are already permeating the institution, the organization, right? There are lots and lots of good reasons to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, but you need to figure out your organization's why, to know what it is that you're going to focus on. And then the final one I'll cover briefly is the when, and the doing better is prioritizing it now. The common mistake is to put it off for whenever. Lots of organizations make the mistake that they'll prioritize D&I after X, Y, or Z, right? They feel like it's something that's important, but only after they deal with whatever other immediate crisis they need to deal with. So for example, when the coronavirus hit in March, American companies cut back sharply on hiring their D&I positions. Now, of course, they cut back on all hiring, but it was even more of a drastic difference when it came to these D&I positions. But then when protests erupted following the murder of George Floyd, all of a sudden those positions became available again, and they were and at an increasing rate compared to other ones. And so what we want to remember is how we can prioritize D&I now, even when we're facing other obstacles, even when we have other priorities. And one thing to keep in mind is how can we plant seeds now while people are paying attention, while this feels like something of national and global importance, that we can use to maintain long-term engagement, right? So how can we harness the powerful feelings that people are having right now to get them to commit to being engaged over time? Pre-commitment can be a powerful tool in behavioral science. And so I think it's an important tool to try to leverage in this moment so that we can get people who are looking for opportunities to engage, sometimes for the first time, give them those opportunities to commit to engaging, so that if it's not quite as focal, again, in the news, whether it's nationally or wherever you are, you can still do the work even when it's not quite as focal. And so now I want to turn to the how. So how can we use behavioral science to learn what fosters diversity, equity, and inclusion in our organizations? Behavioral design is basically just kind of the idea that we're going to try to craft environments that make it more likely that we'll see the behaviors we want to see, and less likely to see the behaviors that we don't want to see. And I'm going to walk you through a four-step framework for thinking about behavioral design. This was from the Behavioral Insights team. And when they created these steps, it's not specific to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this has really been deployed to think about things like, how can we get people to recycle more, or pay their taxes, or finish a full antibiotic regimen, right? All sorts of things when we're trying to create the circumstances that allow people to engage in the kinds of behaviors we want to see. And we're going to apply it to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it's not specific for this. And so when we think about the four steps, I'll walk you through the four steps and then think about the common mistakes that happen along each of these steps. So first, you're going to need to define your outcome. What is the behavior that you're trying to influence? And consider how you can measure this reliably and efficiently. Are you trying to change the representation of the people you hire? Are you trying to change the representation across different departments in your organization? Are you trying to create an environment where feelings of belonging are the same regardless of people's social identity? You have to think about what your specific goal is and how you're going to measure it so that we can know whether we're actually improving things as intended or whether something isn't working as intended. Then you need to diagnose why things aren't already the way you want them, right? So we've thought about the metrics, we've thought about the goals that we have, and next we need to understand, diagnose the problems that we have, do some sort of analysis for why we're currently having problems. This is going to require that you visit the situation and the people and talk to people to understand the context from their perspective, thinking about why it's not working already. And once you understand why things aren't working already, if you can understand the different obstacles that people may be facing, for example, then you can think about what solutions are going to be most appropriate. And what's key here is selecting solutions that specifically target the problem you have and the reason that you're having that problem. And then last, in step 4, we need to put our intervention into practice so we can find out if we've done anything successful, if this idea is actually going to help us move us closer to our goals. Wherever possible, you want to use randomized controlled trials because it will be easier to determine whether what you're doing is working. But even if you can't do that, have a plan in place for how you're going to learn. What's my plan for learning whether the things that I'm doing are working or not? And so organizations will make mistakes with each of these. And so let's just think about each of these steps and think about what mistake is likely to show up in each one. So first, some organizations will just jump in trying to improve D&I without ever defining what their goal is or the outcome that they're trying to improve. Just thinking sort of generally about, oh, it would be great to have a more diverse or more inclusive workforce without thinking specifically about what that would look like in your organization. How would you know? The second mistake is that people often try to jump to solutions before having really investigated and understood what the problems are that they're facing. And one particularly common version of this is for organizations to look for quick and easy solutions, like hosting a diversity training session, even though the problems are difficult and complex. The third problem in this step framework is that often organizations will try to use solutions that aren't specifically targeting the problem that they've identified, either because they haven't done the work to identify the problem, or if they have, they just end up going to other sort of solutions that they've heard about without thinking about whether it actually targets the problem they have. And so this often looks like borrowing solutions from other places because it worked somewhere else without actually doing the work to understand whether you have the same problem and whether it's caused by the same thing. If the problems or the causes don't match up, then someone else's solution may or may not work. It's obviously great to try different things that you're seeing working in different places, but you want to make sure that it's tailored to the particular problem that you're working on, rather than just trying something without knowing that it's going to be targeted. And the last mistake is organizations will introduce all sorts of different things without having any metrics at play, or without having any goals and plans for how they're going to learn about what's working. And with all of these mistakes, sometimes I'm surprised, because you wouldn't imagine an organization doing this same kind of mistake, falling into the same trap when it comes to lots of other parts of their organization. And yet, for some reason in D&I, we consistently see these same kinds of mistakes going on. So I thought what I would do is try to make this a little bit more concrete with two examples. And specifically, what I'm going to try to highlight is the connection between diagnosing problems and thinking about solutions. And so my first example comes from data that McKinsey put out a few years ago. And this was across lots of organizations and thousands of employees. And what they're doing is they're mapping representation of different employees from an entry-level position all the way through to the C-suite. And so first thing, I hope what jumps out at you is when you look at this, that it's easy to identify that there are some problems here. That if your goal is to have equitable representation throughout your organization, that's just not happening in this data. And so then the question is, why isn't it happening, and what can we do about it? And so I think one thing that we can do is sort of break it up and think think carefully about what our specific goals are. And so, for example, if you're thinking about gender, so now what I'm going to ask you to do is just glance back and forth between the two blue boxes at the top, and you'll see one for white men and one for white women. What you'll notice is that at step one, there's a little bit of a difference, but not a big difference, not a huge difference. But if you look at step two, all of a sudden, you see a dramatic change. And if you glance down and compare men of color to women of color, you'll see something similar. Step one, pretty much the same. Step two is where we start to see differences. So why am I highlighting this? Well, when it comes to gender, these data suggest that our primary pain point is promotion from the entry level to that first management position. Right? And so if we want to understand why we're having problems and we want to make things better, what we need to do is dig in to try to understand why men and women at our organizations are having different experiences when they start at the firm. But now I'm going to ask you to consider race and ethnicity. And so this time, instead of comparing horizontally, look vertically now. And so if you look at the difference between white men and men of color, or white women and women of color, what you'll notice is that from that very first step, step one, we're already seeing big differences. And so in that case, it may not be that first promotion that's going to attract your attention and your inquiry. Instead, it may be that first step. If we want to make things equitable throughout, when it comes to bringing in employees of color, it may be that our recruitment effort, that first opportunity for hiring, how do we get more people in the front door, may be an important part of us diagnosing problems that may currently exist and what we will be able to do to make things better over time. And of course, it's worth noting the intersection of this. So if you look at women of color, they are not being brought in the door to the same extent as white women are, but they're also not being promoted as much as men of color are. And so they're hitting both of these. And so if we're going to improve things for women of color, we're going to need to think about all of these pain points and understand how they're operating on different employees and what we can do to support all of the employees that we can get in the door so that they can go through the process of moving through the organization. Now I'm going to turn to a different example, and this is entirely hypothetical data, so I just made this up. But I want you to imagine two worlds. So two companies, let's say, and they both are hiring 25% women on average and 75% men on average, and have decided this is a problem, and they're going to think about what they can do that would be better. Now this looks like it's the same, but what I want to suggest is that if we can dig deeper to understand the full process, we might see differences that are going to point us in towards different solutions. So if we unpack this, starting from the applications, then you narrow it down to a long list, a short list, some number of people you interview, and then from there you're going to hire some. Well, if you look at one side, you're going to see it was 50-50 at the applications and 50-50 throughout the process, right up until that final decision to hire. That's very different from the other world I created. In the other world, the balance of applications was already skewed 75% male, 25% female, and so nothing changed as you went through the process, but from the very get-go, you weren't finding applications that were evenly distributed across genders. And so what does that mean? Well, if your goal, again, if your goal is to hire more equitably, if your goal is to hire something closer to 50-50, these two worlds are going to lead to very different solutions. So in the first case, you're going to want to really dig into your interview process. What's going on in our interview? If we bring people in for interviews and men and women are equally likely to be interviewed, why is it? What is it about the interview that is leading to us consistently hiring the men that we interview? That's one organization's problem to solve. But the other organization doesn't look like anything's going on in the interview. Instead, it's about those applications. And so that really points to the initial recruiting process. Is it about the words that you're using in your word ad that aren't as appealing across genders, or the requirements that you're insisting on? Or is it where you're posting your ad, right? There are lots of different things you can think about for recruitment, but that's going to be very different than trying to solve a problem that has to do with your interview. And it's possible that you need to do both, of course, but it's really important to narrow in and focus on what the problems are and why the problems are there so that you can think about the right solutions. And so back to the steps that we were talking about, and think about how to do better, not to fall into the trap that lots of organizations are making. And so first, define your outcome. What are your goals? What metrics are going to be most relevant for your organization's why? And again, there are lots and lots of reasons to do this work. And so what's important is to think about why specifically is your organization doing this? Is it because you want to make sure that you have the best talent that's out there? Is it because you want to reach certain customers and make sure that your employee base matches your customer base? Is it because you think that it's going to help with innovation, and that's a fundamental sort of driver in your organization? Is it because you have social justice goals, and this just fits right into your social justice goals? Whatever it might be, you want to make sure you're defining specifically how you're going to know whether you're getting closer to the goal that you've established for yourself. Now, I took steps 2 and 3, and I put them together. And I did this because this is the thing that I think sometimes gets lost, is that we want to think about these as a joint process. We diagnose problems so that we can come up with solutions that are tailored to those problems, right? If you can understand the cause of inequity in a given context, then you can generate solutions that are specifically going to target that inequity. Just a sort of a reminder here is that you're going to want to be diagnosing inequity that could emerge from formal processes and informal processes. To do that, you're going to have to be willing to step beyond your own lived experience to try to understand why work is being experienced differently for different people. And then the final step of this is finding out what's working and learning, the process of learning. And so what I wrote here is experiment, experiment, experiment. This is a bit of a mantra for me. And so I mean it in 2 ways. So first, as I mentioned before, to the extent that you can introduce a randomized control group, then you're going to be able to learn so much and so easily from anything that you try. So that's a call to do that when it's possible. But I use the word experiment in other ways too. I also mean that you just have to be willing to try new things, right? If our goal is to learn, then even quote unquote failures can be part of a successful journey, right? So if we're too afraid to try something new, or we're too afraid to evaluate something that we're trying, then we're never going to know how to make things better. And so let me just end. I'll come back to, I'll put the what, who, why, when back up, and now add a little bit more detail to the how. So how can we use the tools of behavioral science to learn? Well, what I'm really asking is for us to bring rigor to D&I that we bring to all other aspects of our organization. We need to walk through the steps so that we have a clear goal that we're aiming towards. We understand why we're not achieving it now. We think about the solutions that target that problem, and we test our solutions to find out whether we were right or whether there's something else that would be better for us to be doing. I think that these problems are too important for us to pretend that they don't exist. And they're also too important for us just to be guessing about what's going to work. We can try out things that have worked in other places, but we really need to be prepared to test what's working for our own organizations. So I think that we can do better if we apply behavioral science and use behavioral design to think through these problems. And if we can do better, then we should do better.
You know, with more organizations working remote and working virtually, how do you see this affecting the behaviors and inclusivity of employers?
So this is a great question because it's obviously incredibly timely for now and for the foreseeable future anyway. So my first reaction to this is to think about how you're running your meetings. Because people will often say that meetings are like the window to the inclusivity in that larger organization, or at least within the team, how those meetings are run. And so that would be sort of both in terms of learning how our meetings are going and what is our culture like, especially in this online world, and also critical for thinking about how we can do better. So when it comes to our meetings, one important thing, and I've seen this suggested in lots of different formats, is making sure that people still feel like that they are known as an individual. And this can be a really simple check-in. But if you just give people a little bit of space to bring themselves and who they are into a meeting, it creates a much more open environment. And so I think a lot of organizations have kind of figured this out over time, that they may need to create space for people to connect as individuals and people in this difficult time before diving into the content of the meeting. And so that's one thing you might try for inclusivity. It's also really important just to think about who is included and who's not included in all of these different kinds of meetings. And in the Zoom world, this is actually a little bit more tracking this is a little bit more clear, in the sense that you're not having the random conversation over at the water cooler or by the coffee. Everything has to be set up online to have these communications. And so this really could be an opportunity to make sure that everybody is being brought in for the things where their expertise and their perspective and their experience is going to be relevant, rather than having all of these kind of informal offshoots. So there's a version in which it's easier to diagnose and really dig into what's working and what's not, the more formal a process is. And so because our meetings have become more formal, at least in terms of who's scheduled, who's included, when it happens, and things like that, there's a lot of actually exploration you can do there to figure out whether everybody is being included or whether they're not. And remembering that people's experiences, their situations are going to be so incredibly different right now. And so whether someone has kids who are home or someone who's sick that they're taking care of, all of these things are things you want to be actively thinking about so that you can support all of your employees no matter what their current situation and experience is.
Thank you so much for that. So, you know, taking a look at how we run our meetings and who is included are you know, very specific things that we can take a look at paying attention to. We have a lot of questions coming in, and Candace in particular asks if organizations' goals is to create an inclusive culture. What metrics and measurements do you suggest?
So there are some different ways to think about this. So I'm a psychologist. That's been my background and my training. So I love a good self-report, right? What will tell you whether people feel like they belong at your organization better than asking them, to what extent do you feel like you belong? So I think that there's a lot of parts of like a climate survey that you might already be running that would be very good tools for you for trying to figure out whether you're creating an inclusive workforce. Now, what's really key here, though, is that you're not going to look at just a mean, especially if you have an organization that is skewed towards certain populations. Well, then a high mean doesn't necessarily say that you've actually created an inclusive organization. So you want to be able to look at how this changes depending on race or gender or other demographic variables, or even the hierarchy within your organization. You want to be able to look to understand, now not at an individual level, we're not looking to call out people. You want to run, if you want people to respond honestly, it needs to be an anonymous or a confidential survey. And so those climate surveys, but there's so much data there for us to pull out. And so one metric would be to say something like, we want to see similar levels of belonging or similar willingness to recommend our organization as a place to work across different groups. And if you're not finding that, then there may be a pain point. Now, let me just add one other element, which is that although I'm a big fan of self-report, I know that that's sometimes a sticking point for organizations. Well, what does it mean that they say they don't feel this way? Or what does it mean that they don't feel like their voice is heard? And so it's also possible to think more about other objective metrics that you could have. We know, I'm going to come back to meetings again. We know that meetings are not the same. Some people talk a lot, some people don't. Some people are interrupted every time they speak, some people are not. This has a powerful contribution to whether people feel like they're included. And so you can actually get apps to track who's talking and who's interrupting. And this is also back to the question about remote. This is going to be a lot easier to do right now than when we were in person. And so you might think about other kinds of objective metrics or assignment to different opportunities, right? That's another place where you see discrepancies in how organizations do this. If you're assigning stretch opportunities to some groups more than others, you should know that. And so even if you're not just asking, do you feel like you've been assigned to good opportunities, you can actually track how you're doing it. And so I think depending on what specific goal you have, what is the concern over inclusion? Is it their voice? Is it the opportunities they're given? Is it the network that they're in? You can think about how you could go beyond self-report as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. There's a couple of questions in here about, that we didn't spend a whole lot of time on the term equity, and which is, kind of a fairly new term in philosophy. So in your research, does this go beyond representation, pay, equity, supplier diversity, et cetera?
Yeah, so I think of it, I guess the way that I think about it is, how can we create an equitable work environment? And we sort of start with that. And I actually when I teach, I start with that I start with that question, because I want people to reflect for themselves, what would it mean for me to know that I'm in an equitable organization? And usually what I find when people do this is that the two things that the two buckets, rather, not only two things, but the two buckets that people come up with when they think about an equitable organization, one has to do with representation and maps onto a lot of our diversity questions, that's one way to know we're working in an equitable organization. And the other has to do with lots of the parts that fit into inclusion. It's a place where everybody's voice is heard. It's a place where everybody feel like they can belong. It's a place where everybody's given opportunities regardless of social background. And so for me, I think of equity as kind of the big question, as another word for kind of thinking about what kind of organization would I like to work for? What's the kind of organization that's going to have the values that I think are important? And so you get equity up at the top, and then diversity and inclusion are parts of what contributes to equity. I do think when people talk about equity and define it, one of the important things to think about is that it doesn't mean sameness. Right? Equity means supporting people, and it doesn't require that support look exactly the same for every person. It creates more complicated conversations and discussions over what your goals are and what it means to create an equitable, fair organization. But you don't want to think about equity as everybody's being treated the same. That is typically kind of that does not fit into an inclusive framework. And so that's important to think about the difference between equity and something like being exactly equal. That's not what being treated exactly equal is not what we mean when we talk about equity.
Yeah, and so it's interesting because Joe's asking, to come to a more even representation, wouldn't companies need to exclusively hire or promote minorities and women for several cycles? And have there been companies who have done this kind of aggressive approach to bridge the gap quicker?
There are different versions that we've seen introduced. So I can't think of an organization, but that doesn't mean that that they don't exist. I can't think of organizations that have done that specifically for hiring, to say we will not hire anybody from this, we will only hire from that. At least within the US, you're going to run into certain kinds of laws that are going to make that a challenge to do. And so when we think about quotas, there may be, you have to be sort of super thoughtful about how you do this. And so, for example, you might use quotas. What I have seen people do very successfully is use quotas like throughout a hiring process, but not necessarily on that final decision to hire. So one thing that we've seen in the research is that if you interview more women or you interview more people of color, then you're more likely to hire one. And so a lot of people will set up quotas for who they're going to interview. And so there may be quotas that you kind of think about earlier in the process, but on that final decision, you aren't thinking about quotas anymore. And so there may be other things that you can sort of do around this. But there are places where we've seen quotas put into place around the world, and perhaps things like boards, things like political representation. And it's mixed. The results are sort of mixed. And in large part, this is just another call towards, it depends what you're fighting against. So political representation, where they've used quotas, India is a nice example of this. And so it's basically been like a randomized controlled design, because certain places are getting women at different times. And you can see this, the scholars who have used this and looked at this have seen huge changes in breaking stereotypes and making it so that people, individuals and families feel differently about who can serve in these different positions. And so that's something that would sort of cycle faster. The work that looks at women on boards doesn't seem to have nearly that same kind of spillover. The data doesn't suggest it. And it's probably because it wasn't a stereotype that was standing in the way, right? Or also just that the visibility of board members may not be nearly as salient to you as the visibility of political representation. So just like any tool, instead of starting with the solution, like let's use a quota, I would start with thinking about why we're not hiring right now and think about what solutions would work. And maybe some version of a quota would be useful for you, but maybe not. It really depends on what goals you're specifically trying to solve there.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you brought in sort of the boards and the way that this is being handled in politics to kind of take things a little bit of a broader perspective. And, that kind of ties in a little bit to this next question that we have that asks, to what degree should corporate DEI activities include those focused on social justice knowledge versus specifically work-related. And part of the problem is that people bring their preconceived notions about the existence and the scope of discrimination, both in and out of corporate America, into the corporate environment.
So I think there's a few pieces to this question, and so one thing to just think about is that a lot of work, if you think about other parts of your organization that aren't D&I, a lot of it does require that you first start by getting on the same page, right? If you bring in people, especially think about working across departments. When you're trying to leverage the experiences that and knowledge that people have across departments to do something, to manage a project together, you're going to have to exchange enough knowledge so that you're on the same page. Otherwise, it's going to be just misunderstanding after misunderstanding. And so there may be some need when it comes to D&I too to get people on the same page. I was talking about that before in terms of your goals and objectives, but you also need to get people onto the same page in terms of current state. How is it right now? What is true right now? And you'll find that people answer differently. So you need to get everybody onto the same page. So there may be work to do, and it may be, I would say that that's going to be true whether you're thinking about this from a more business, like making the business case, or the more moral social justice case. And my interpretation of the data and people's experiences is that it's important to align your goals. This is what I mentioned earlier. So I think it would be strange for an organization that doesn't think at all about social justice. If that's not part and parcel of your organization already, it may be hard to bring that in now as something that everybody's going to be able to understand and get on board with. But for other organizations, this is just what they live and breathe. And so this would be a perfectly natural way to start the conversation. I think what's important is that whatever your reason, there's lots of business case reasons, there's lots of moral reasons to think about it, whatever it is, you want it to be something that can be easily understood throughout the organization and easily expressed to people outside the organization as well. And so I think that's what helps bring people onto the same page and allow them to really get to work on some of this rather than being confused by each other.
Yeah, so coming from a place of knowing what the cause is, what the goals are, and then having that be aligned and then clearly communicated are kind of the key pieces for all of that. I wonder, we've got another question here about, just asking, can conscious diversity lead to a lack of fairness? And for example, hiring more women as a policy versus leaving out more deserving men, can it be an unfair practice?
So this is something that organizations are going to need to think through. I can tell you that I personally find the call, that there's reverse discrimination or things of that. I think that that is not supported in the objective reality, at least at the group level. It is still the case that groups that have been underrepresented and have less power, that's still true. But for an individual, it's really important that any individual, regardless of who it is, also feel that they are given opportunities at work. And so it's a balancing act. I don't think you need to decide what is okay and what's not okay. And this comes back to the question of equity. We're not going to treat everybody exactly the same, but what is appropriate? And again, it's going to depend on what your goals are, why you're doing this in the first place. But for a lot of organizations, I think people would be comfortable with the idea that we've been living for this many years in this world. If we want to leverage experiences and perspectives from lots of different people, and we want to make sure we're actually getting all the best talent, we're going to need to make sure that the current way our organization is running is not leaving some people out. I think that certain solutions are more palatable to everybody, and some solutions are only palatable if everybody's on board with some sort of social justice goal. And so when you don't want individual employees to feel like they're being left out. And in fact, I think one of the important things is to make sure there's a call for everybody to feel like they're part of creating an inclusive organization, and they're also part of creating they're part of creating a better culture. So there's research that suggests that you absolutely want to bring men in to calls for gender equity. If you leave it over there, then first of all, it means the women are doing all the work to try to make things better, but it also means that all the ideas are theirs. And instead, a deliberate call that gender equity is something that matters to everybody here, then you can bring in all of those perspectives together and figure out which solutions are going to allow you to make progress on these whatever gender goals you have without leaving other employees feeling like they're being looked over or not given opportunities.
We have another question here about what do you and do other employees who continue to be resistant to any D&I efforts? So what do you do about employees that continue to be resistant to any D&I efforts?
So a couple of thoughts here. So first of all, it depends on who this employee is. If this is the top of your food chain, it's going to be a problem. If it's one person in one part, it will be a problem for the people who have to maybe directly interact with them, but maybe not beyond that. And it kind of depends what you mean by resistance. Resistance to sort of big changes and structural changes, or resistant to even the idea that you should be treating people with respect, and you should be treating people equitably so that everybody's voice matters, right? There are certain behaviors that from the top you're gonna wanna hold your employees accountable for, and make sure that doesn't happen. But a lot of effort in this space, I think, can be made even if you have a handful of people who aren't totally on board. So if you imagine that there's sort of a group of people who are already working towards this, who have cared about this their whole life, they're sort of completely devoted to it. And then there might be another group where they're very resistant, and every time this word comes up, it triggers something. The thing to remember is that there's a bigger group in the middle, probably the largest group of all, that is in between. And those are the groups that's the people you want to be speaking to. That's the people that you want to sort of just change the norms, change the way things are happening enough so that so that you see a shift in the organization, even if there's a few people who haven't gone along with the shift. Once they're the ones who are out of the norm, then they won't be able to interfere as much. I will note, just back to the research about what works and what doesn't in terms of representation anyway, what they found is that a lot of things that don't have the word diversity and inclusion work really well. So when you talk about things like mentoring, yes, mentoring may be a good solution for you, but it doesn't have to specifically be towards certain groups. And so you may think if the problems are the connections between people and whether they have sponsors, you might want to create a mentoring or a sponsoring program, and you wouldn't resist it because you don't know that it's not specifically called out as diversity and inclusion. And just giving people the chance to work with people who are different from them really can change the way people interact. That can be a big, powerful thing to do. And so you don't have to call that anything. That's just the way you're thinking about your teams, right? And so you don't necessarily, I guess what I would say is you don't necessarily need everybody actively on board for the effort, but if they're standing in the way by actually sort of creating real problems for people, then that's something you're gonna need to sort of deal with in terms of what's acceptable behavior and how we're gonna hold people accountable.
Well, Professor Risen, thank you so much for taking the time to share all of these insights with all of us and to help us move a little bit closer in our D&I goals, which are complex to say the least. Yeah. This is a really good amount of pragmatic information that's really going to help us, identify those common mistakes and learn how to do better. And thank you to all of you for taking out the time in your busy days to invest in learning about this important topic. We do invite you to stay connected with us, and you can stay up to date with the latest human resources, HR resources, and also following ExecOnline on LinkedIn. So please do join us there. Again, thank you very much, Professor Risen, for all of this valuable information. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.